On December 24, 1857, Christmas Eve in Savannah, Georgia, the Chamberlain family's grand plantation house became a slaughterhouse. 4 brothers, Jonathan, Paul, Samuel, and Thomas, were hacked to death by a woman who had served their table for years. Her name was Phyllis. She was 28 years old, born into Riverbend Plantation. By trade, she was a house servant, forced to carry food and pour wine for men who ruled her life. For years she endured their laughter, their sermons, their whips, but that night she became something else. With the same axe she had used to chop firewood for their comfort, she delivered judgment. The Chamberlains were not ordinary masters. Jonathan, the eldest, cloaked his cruelty in philosophy, quoting Latin while ordering lashes. Paul preyed on children. Samuel, a preacher, made his slaves pray before he beat them. Thomas, youngest, was so short-tempered, he once shot a man for sneezing in church. They embodied every hypocrisy of the slave South: wealthy, violent, God-fearing only in words. Phyllis's breaking point came with Isaiah Carter. He was the man she loved, a fellow slave who had promised to one day buy their freedom. Jonathan Chamberlain dangled that hope before her, promising manumission if she worked faithfully through Christmas. Instead, the brothers sold Isaiah, and when he attempted escape, his new master had him crippled, tortured, and killed. Phyllis received the news in silence. She never wept. She kept cooking, cleaning, serving, but from that moment on she was no longer their servant. She was their executioner in waiting. That Christmas Eve, Savannah glowed with candles, hymns, and the smell of roasted meat. But in the slave quarters at Riverbend, there was only cold, damp air and the cough of sickness. Phyllis sat near the dying fire, staring at the flames as if they were whispering Isaiah's voice. She rose, collected the axe hidden among the kindling, and walked toward the big house. Inside, the Chamberlain brothers feasted. Their table groaned with turkey, rum, and polished silver. Phyllis moved silently among them, pouring wine, trimming candles, placing firewood in the hearth. To them she was invisible. To herself, she was already beyond fear. By midnight, as carols drifted across the city, the Riverbend mansion erupted in screams. In less than 3 minutes, 4 men were reduced to blood and bone on marble floors. Each swing of the axe was precise, cold, as though it had been rehearsed in her mind 1,000 nights. Their wealth, their power, their lineage, all ended in that room, on that Christmas night. Tomorrow the papers would call it savagery. The courts would brand her insane. But the truth remains. Phyllis turned Christmas Eve into a night of reckoning, a night when one enslaved woman carried the weight of centuries of suffering and struck back. The cold night after Christmas Eve did not quiet the land. Savannah woke to bells and hymns, but in Riverbend Plantation the marble floors still bore the stains of 4 men who thought themselves untouchable. The Chamberlain brothers were dead, and the house smelled of blood and smoke instead of roasted turkey and pine garlands. What happened in those moments after the killings did not vanish into silence. It spread like fire across the quarters, into the fields, and deep into the swamps where fugitives hid. Phyllis had not killed in a frenzy. Every blow of the axe was deliberate, each one the punctuation of a sentence she had rehearsed for years. Yet when the last body fell, when the brothers lay broken, there was no triumph on her face, only a stillness that frightened even those who had prayed for this night. She left the axe where it dropped, its blade sticky and dark, and walked back into the quarters with a face as calm as stone. The others stared at her as if she carried lightning in her hands. In the quarters the air was heavy. Smoke from the single fire barely masked the stink of damp rags and old sweat. The walls were rough planks that still echoed with the cries of those whipped and chained there. Rats moved under the straw mattresses. Coughs rattled children's lungs. But that night, for the first time, the quarters breathed something else: expectation. Old Elijah, whose back carried scars older than some of the masters, looked at Phyllis and muttered, "It's begun." His voice trembled not from fear, but from the weight of prophecy. Others shifted uneasily. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers to a God who had been silent for so long. But others, mostly the young, leaned forward, their eyes bright in the firelight. The sight of their oppressors torn apart like cattle had given them something stronger than prayer. Phyllis said little. She sat by the fire, her dress stiff with dried blood, her eyes hollow. When asked what she would do now, she answered only once: "They took Isaiah. They will take no more." The conspiracy was not born that night. It had been growing for months, in whispers and coded glances, in stolen moments by the well, in murmurs beneath hymns sung on Sundays. But the killings set the final spark. The slaves of Riverbend, long crushed into silence, began to speak aloud the unspeakable. They met in the darkest hours, when even the dogs slept, at first in pairs, then in small gatherings behind the cane sheds. or near the old cemetery where moss hung heavy from the trees. That place was sacred, a field of unmarked graves where generations of enslaved lay. Some swore that at night the earth itself whispered, demanding justice. The wind moaned through the branches like voices, and the air smelled of iron, as though the soil itself bled. It was there, in the cemetery, that the plan began to take form. Ezekiel, the blacksmith, with arms as thick as hammers, drew lines in the dirt with a stick. He marked the paths between the quarters and the big house, the gates, the overseer's hut, and the road to Savannah. Jonas, a wiry field hand who knew every hidden ditch and gully, traced escape routes toward the swamps. A girl named Ruth, barely 16, swore she would carry the babies on her back if it came to flight. Each had a reason, each a wound that could never heal, and there was more than human planning. Mora, an old woman with clouded eyes, sat rocking by the graves, murmuring in a language no one remembered but all felt. She said the land itself had spoken to her in dreams. She saw fire devouring the cane, saw blood soaking the white marble of the house, saw thunder splitting the sky into three thunders, she whispered, and the chains break. The word spread like a lit fuse. Weapons were gathered. A rusted hoe was sharpened to a blade. Knives meant for cutting meat were hidden in rags. A bottle of herbs from Mora's pouch promised poison enough to stop a man's heart. And always the axe, the same one Phyllis had used. She kept it clean now, its handle wrapped in cloth, as though it were a relic, a holy thing. The overseer, Daniel Briggs, loomed like a shadow over their lives. He was known for his cruelty, for hanging men from trees as warnings, for forcing women into his shed. His death, the slaves agreed, must come first. To strike him was to strike the whip itself. And behind him, the wives of the Chamberlains, their cousins, the other kin who might try to seize the plantation's reins. No one was spared in the planning. If you wore the name Chamberlain, your blood was marked. Fear and hope twisted together in the hearts of the conspirators. Some nights they shook with terror at what might come. The patrols, the dogs, the soldiers from Savannah, who would surely come once blood was spilled. But then they remembered Isaiah, broken under the lash. They remembered the children born only to be sold. They remembered the screams in the night that the walls of the quarters still seemed to carry, and fear gave way to resolve. The night meetings grew bolder. Voices no longer whispered but spoke with a hard edge. "We've been dead already," Ezekiel said. "Best to die standing," Ruth answered, "or live running." Both were true. Phyllis remained silent through much of it. But when asked to lead, she finally stood. Her eyes were not the eyes of the house girl anymore. They were sharp, cold, full of something that made even the men look down. "We strike at night," she said, "when their bellies are heavy and their tongues thick with rum. We strike not as thieves in shadows, but as a storm. So the land remembers, so their children remember, so God remembers." And so the conspiracy was sealed. Not just a plan, but a covenant. They would turn Riverbend, the house of the Chamberlains, into a grave. They would make the fields burn, the air scream, the soil drink its fill. Christmas had begun the work. The new year would finish it. The first days after Christmas passed in a silence heavy enough to choke. The Chamberlain house stood like a mausoleum, its windows shuttered, its doors barred, its halls echoing with nothing but the flies that swarmed the bloodstains on the marble. In Savannah, rumors spread. The brothers are dead, cut down by their own slave. Some whispered it with fear, some with awe. But in Riverbend itself, the silence meant only one thing. The master's kin were gathering. Their cousins, their wives, their overseer, each one trying to stitch the torn fabric of their power back together. But the threads would not hold. Because in the shadows of the quarters, the plan had ripened. What Phyllis had begun with her axe was no accident, no solitary madness. It was the opening blow of a storm that would not stop. On the second night after the massacre, Ezekiel the blacksmith crept to the edge of the overseer's hut. The man inside, Daniel Briggs, was asleep, drunk, his whip coiled at the foot of his bed like a pet snake. Briggs had long been the hand of terror at Riverbend. It was he who dragged men into the cane fields and left them half dead in ditches. He who carved scars into children's backs with the precision of an artist. His breath that night stank of rum. His snores rattled through the thin walls. Ezekiel stood with a hammer in his hand, the same hammer he had used for years to shoe the master's horses. He did not swing at once. He waited, listening to the rhythm of Briggs's sleep, waiting for the right moment. Then, in one motion, he brought the hammer down on the man's skull. The sound was like a melon splitting, wet and soft. Briggs did not scream, just a grunt, then silence. Ezekiel hit again, until the man's face was no longer a face but pulp. When it was done, He wiped the hammer on the overseer's sheets and walked out into the night. The quarters erupted in a sound that was not cheer, but release. One chain had snapped, others would follow. The killings moved with method. Jonas and Ruth took knives into the kitchen of the big house. There they found Mrs. Chamberlain, Jonathan's widow, and her sister-in-law, both seated in mourning black, drinking wine to steady their nerves. They barely looked up when the two slaves entered. To them, Ruth was only a girl sent to fetch wood, Jonas only a servant carrying water. The knives slid from sleeves into hands, and in seconds the women's throats were open, red lines across pale skin. The sisters clutched at their pearls as blood poured over lace. Jonas caught one by the chin and hissed, "For Isaiah, for all of us," before she collapsed on the carpet. By dawn, 3 more overseers had fallen. One dragged from his horse and gutted in the fields, his blood soaking into the cane. Another poisoned with herbs boiled into his brandy. The third cornered in the stables, his head smashed against the very beams he used to hang others from. Each death was not just an act of vengeance, it was a sentence carried out by those who had lived too long under his hand. But the most terrible trial was saved for the cousins of the Chamberlains who had come to claim the plantation. They sat in the dining hall that night, eating from silver, their boots muddy with the arrogance of men who thought bloodline was enough to protect them. Phyllis herself walked into that hall with the axe in her hands. She did not speak. She simply laid the weapon on the table. The cousins laughed nervously. One raised a pistol, but before he could lift it, Ruth and Jonas stepped from the shadows, blades drawn. Ezekiel blocked the door. Phyllis pointed to the floor. "Kneel," she said. Her voice was low, steady, the voice of someone who had already crossed the threshold between life and death. They hesitated, then one dropped to his knees, the others following, muttering prayers to the same God who had been silent through all their cruelties. The trial was swift. Each crime was spoken aloud. The lashings, the sales of children, the whippings done for sport, the lies of freedom dangled like bait before desperate men. No judge sat, no jury. The verdict was carried in the scars on every back in that room. When the sentence was finished, Ezekiel swung the hammer. Jonas plunged his knife. Ruth slit a throat as cleanly as if she were cutting cloth. The cousins fell one by one, their polished boots kicking against the blood-slick floor. When the last body twitched its final twitch, Phyllis raised the axe. "This house is a grave," she said, and then she brought it down, splitting the table that had fed their arrogance. By midnight, the big house burned. Flames roared through the curtains, devoured the portraits of ancestors, licked up the staircase where so many had walked in pride. The smell was not of feasting but of scorched wood and flesh. Slaves, no longer slaves, stood in the yard watching as the roof collapsed. Some wept, some sang, some simply stared in silence as the old world cracked and bled before their eyes. But even as the fire burned, they knew the reckoning was not over. Savannah would not stay blind to this forever. Soldiers would come. Patrols would sweep the swamps. The price of freedom would be blood and pursuit. But in that moment, as sparks showered against the night sky, they were free. Not tomorrow, not in some promised future, but in that breath, that heartbeat, that night when chains broke and the earth itself seemed to roar approval. The Riverbend conspiracy had become a revolt, and the fire was only the beginning. The fire at Riverbend lit the sky like a second dawn. From miles away, planters and townsfolk in Savannah could see the glow, and they whispered what they dared not speak aloud. "The slaves have risen." For the people in the quarters, the fire was not destruction but purification. They stood in the yard barefoot, faces hot with the blaze, and for the first time in their lives they were not bent, not silent, not owned. But freedom's breath was thin. Everyone knew it would not last. By the second day, horsemen were seen on the roads, riding fast toward Savannah with the news. By the third, rumors came back that militia were gathering, armed men sworn to put down the savagery before it spread to other plantations. The enslaved of Riverbend, now rebels, met again by the cemetery. There the smoke from the big house still curled into the air, drifting over the unmarked graves of those who had died in chains. Phyllis stood before them, her hands still stained, the axe never far. Her voice was calm but without mercy. "They will come for us, with dogs, with muskets, with fire. They think to hunt us back into chains, but we are already free. Better to bleed here in our land than rot in theirs." Ezekiel, the blacksmith, argued that they should strike first, move through the county, burn the cane fields, kill the overseers before word spread further. Others, especially the women with children, wanted to flee into the swamps, where Spanish moss hung heavy and the ground swallowed men whole. Jonas said they must do both, strike hard, then scatter, never letting the enemy find them whole. In the end, they agreed on one path. The overseers and loyal whites nearby would die. Then they would vanish into swamp and pine, carrying their children, their scars, and the memory of what they had done. The killings began at dawn. Ruth, the girl of 16, carried her youngest brother on her back, while clutching a blade in her hand. She led others into the fields, where another overseer still lived. He had once branded a boy for dropping a basket of cotton. Now, as he walked the rows, whip dangling, Ruth and 3 men closed in. They dragged him down into the mud, his whip snapping uselessly in the air. Ruth herself pressed the knife into his throat, watching the blood bubble and soak the cane. "No more," she whispered, voice shaking but steady. The others echoed, "No more." Elsewhere, Ezekiel and Jonas led a raid on the barns, where storehouses of food and arms were kept. They found 2 white tenants hiding there, rifles clutched in trembling hands. The men begged, swearing they had never whipped anyone, that they were only workers. Ezekiel remembered their faces from the times they had cheered at public lashings. He lifted his hammer. One man's skull burst under it like rotten fruit. The other tried to run, but Jonas caught him with a blade to the back. The bodies were dragged outside and left for the crows. But vengeance was not only violence. Some turned their fury on the land itself. Cane fields were set ablaze, the stalks snapping and hissing as fire devoured them. Smoke choked the morning sky, the sweet sick smell of burning sugar mingling with the stink of charred flesh. To those who watched, it was as if the earth itself demanded to drink back what had been stolen. By nightfall, Riverbend was unrecognizable. The big house was ashes, the overseer dead, the cousins slaughtered, the fields ablaze. The rebels gathered once more, but the air was heavy now, no longer only with triumph. The sound of distant drums carried from Savannah, marching feet, the thud of hooves. The militia was coming. Children whimpered in the dark. Old Elijah, the scarred elder, murmured that this was the hour of testing. Some of us will live, some of us will not, but they will never forget. He pressed his hand to the soil of the cemetery and said, "The ground remembers. If we fall, it will carry our names." Phyllis rose and lifted the axe. Her eyes reflected the flames still burning in the fields. "We are already dead to them. Tonight we choose how we live." She ordered the strongest to arm themselves with the remaining tools and blades. Mothers gathered cloth bundles of food, water, and rags. The youngest were told to follow Ruth, who knew the swamps. Ezekiel swore to hold the rear with his hammer. The last act before they fled was to strike a mark on the land. They poured lantern oil across the Chamberlain family cemetery, where marble stones proclaimed wealth and piety. The torches were lit, and fire swept over the graves. Names carved in stone crumbled under heat. To the rebels it was justice. No bloodline would remain unscarred. Then they vanished into the swamp. The night closed over them with its thick stink of rot and water. Mosquitoes rising like smoke. Cypress roots twisted like claws around their path. But in that darkness, they felt something like freedom. No overseer's eyes, no whips crack, only the sound of their own breath, and the distant roar of fire behind them. Behind, Riverbend died. Ahead, the militia hunted. The revolt was not finished. It was only entering its most brutal trial. The swamps would decide who survived, and who became a ghost whispered about for generations. The militia rode at dawn. 30 men on horseback, rifles on their shoulders, pistols in their belts, dogs straining at the leash. Savannah had called it a slave insurrection, and the call for blood echoed through the taverns and churches. Planters trembled that their own houses might burn next. Some whispered that Phyllis was no mere woman but a demon, a witch, a curse sent to punish white men on the holiest of nights. Fear, as always, was their greatest weapon, and their greatest weakness. They reached Riverbend by mid-morning, but there was nothing left to conquer. The big house lay in blackened ruins, beams jutting out like broken bones. The marble floors were a charred grave. The overseer's hut was smeared in blood, his body left for carrion. The cane fields smoldered, a wasteland of ash and smoke. Dogs whined, picking up faint trails into the swamp, but the men hesitated. They knew what the swamp meant. It was not just land, it was a labyrinth, a graveyard for the unwary, and a refuge for those desperate enough to survive in its belly. Inside the swamp, the rebels moved like shadows. The ground sucked at their feet, water rising to their knees. Cypress trees towered, their roots twisting into black pools that swallowed sound. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, biting until the skin was raw. Children clung to their mothers' backs, eyes wide, silent. Phyllis walked at the front, axe slung across her shoulder. Behind her, Ezekiel carried a length of chain he had pulled from the overseer's yard. Once used to bind men, now coiled as a weapon. Ruth darted ahead, barefoot, light as smoke, finding paths invisible to the eye. That night the militia followed. They lit torches, the flames reflected in pools of black water. The dogs howled, noses pressed to the ground. By midnight, they caught the first scent. A boy, no more than 12, had lagged behind, too weak from hunger. The dogs pulled him down. His scream cut through the swamp, sharp and short, then was silenced by rifle fire. The rebels heard it. Some wept silently. Phyllis did not break stride. Every drop of blood is counted, she said. The next day brought the first ambush. Ezekiel had led a group back along the trail, hiding among cypress knees. As the militia passed, the rebels struck. A sharpened stake rammed into a horse's belly, sending it screaming into the muck. Ezekiel's hammer smashed a skull. Ruth slipped behind a man and slit his throat with a blade no longer than her hand. The swamp exploded into chaos. Horses bucking, dogs yelping, men firing wildly into shadows. 2 rebels fell, riddled with bullets, their bodies sinking into black water without a sound. But 5 militia lay dead in the mud. Their rifles, their cartridges, their belts were stripped and carried away. That night the swamp groaned like a living thing. The rebels gathered in a circle, the spoils before them. Rifles were handed out, powder was divided. Mora, the old woman with clouded eyes, spoke again. 3 thunders, she whispered. It is not done until the sky itself speaks. Her words settled over them like prophecy. The militia regrouped. Their commander, Captain James Harlow, was a man who believed himself chosen by God to put down insolence. His father had once owned 100 slaves. His uncle hanged 5 men after the Denmark Vesey scare. Now he swore Phyllis would be brought back alive, to hang as an example. But in his heart he feared her. The men whispered that she had split 4 masters in 3 minutes. They muttered that her axe carried the devil's blessing. By the second night their nerves frayed. Dogs whined. Torches sputtered. Some muttered about turning back. Phyllis sensed it. That evening she led her people deeper, to an island of higher ground where cypress roots tangled like walls. Here we fight, she said. The others looked at her with hollow eyes, hungry, bitten, exhausted, but they obeyed. Weapons were sharpened. Stakes were planted in the mud. Rifles were primed. Mothers hid their children beneath roots, pressing rags to their mouths to keep them silent. The battle came at dawn. The militia advanced with rifles leveled, dogs snarling. The swamp erupted with gunfire. Smoke drifted low over the water, mixing with the mist. Men screamed as sharpened stakes pierced their thighs. A horse toppled, drowning its rider in the muck. Ezekiel swung his hammer until his arm shook, breaking skulls, cracking ribs. Ruth moved like a shadow, darting between trees, her blade flashing red. Jonas fired stolen rifles, his face grim and silent. Phyllis stood in the thick of it, axe in both hands. She met Captain Harlow himself, who charged at her with a saber raised high. Their blades clashed once, steel against iron. The saber bent, the axe split through, burying itself in his chest. Harlow fell into the mud, choking on his own blood, his eyes wide with disbelief. The militia wavered, their commander dead, their numbers broken. They began to retreat. Some drowned in the swamp as they fled. Others staggered back toward Savannah, their torches falling, extinguished in the water. But victory was not without cost. Half the rebels lay dead or dying. Ezekiel had fallen, a bullet in his chest, his hammer slipping into the muck. Ruth carried him until he begged her to leave him, whispering, "Better here than in chains." When the last gunfire faded, the swamp was silent again, save for the croak of frogs and the drip of blood into water. The survivors gathered, fewer now but unbroken. Phyllis stood over the bodies of her comrades, her face streaked with ash and blood. "They will call us demons," she said. "Let them. Better to be their nightmare than their property." The swamp had swallowed the dead, both white and black. But those who lived carried a new fire inside. They were no longer slaves. They were fugitives, rebels, legends. And though soldiers would return, though bloodhounds would sniff the trails, something had already been carved into the soil of Georgia that no patrol could erase. The swamp did not rest. Even after the militia had been broken, even after Captain Harlow's blood seeped into its black water, the night air still carried the sound of pursuit. Riverbend's survivors knew the truth. Savannah would not forgive, nor would the planters who had watched their neighbors burn. This revolt would be written as terror, not justice, and the hunt would not stop until every man, woman, and child was accounted for in chains or graves. On the 3rd day after the battle, The survivors split. It was the only way to endure. Families with children moved deeper into the wetlands, where the water rose to the chest and cypress knees jutted like daggers. Others, mostly the young and strong, turned north, aiming for the pine barrens and the secret routes that sometimes led fugitives toward the coast. Phyllis remained with the smaller band, the ones too frail to move quickly, the mothers carrying infants, the wounded who could not walk without aid. Her axe never left her hands. She sharpened it with a stone at night, its steel glinting in the faint firefly light. "This land knows us," she told the circle one evening. "Every drop we spill feeds it. It will not betray us if we do not betray each other." Some nodded, others wept quietly. Old Elijah, too weak to walk, murmured that the swamp would be their last sanctuary. "When we fall, it will hold us. Better here than in their gallows." By the week's end, patrols returned. Muskets cracked in the distance. Dogs bayed. One band of fugitives, those who fled north, were cornered in the pine woods. Accounts later claimed they fought to the last, using stolen rifles until their powder ran out, then stones and fists. Their bodies were strung on trees as warnings, left for crows. But rumors whispered that a few broke through the cordon and reached the coast, vanishing onto a schooner bound for the Bahamas. No one ever proved it, but the story was enough to frighten planters for years. Phyllis's band remained hidden longer. They moved through black water that stank of rot, living on fish caught with sharpened sticks, roots dug from the mud, and whatever scraps they had taken from Riverbend stores. Children cried less now, not because fear had lessened, but because hunger had quieted their voices. Mothers pressed rags soaked in swamp water to their lips to keep them silent when dogs passed close. But silence could not protect them forever. One night, as fog rolled low and heavy, the dogs caught their trail, muskets flared, and chaos split the stillness. 2 men fell immediately, bullets tearing their backs as they tried to flee. A woman carrying a baby stumbled into the muck. She screamed as soldiers dragged her out by her hair. Phyllis and Ruth struck from the shadows, blades flashing. The baby survived, the woman did not. Blood mixed with black water until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. By dawn, only a handful remained with Phyllis. Ruth, her face gaunt and hollow, clutched the child like it was her own. Mora, the blind old woman, still whispered of 3 thunders. Her voice cracked but unbroken. "One thunder was the axe," she croaked. "The second was the fire. The third has not yet come." The militia pressed harder. Traps were set. Men with torches burned dry patches of the swamp, smoke choking the fugitives out of hiding. One by one, the rebels were cut down. Some died fighting, others drowned to avoid capture. Each time a comrade fell, Phyllis grew quieter, her gaze harder. She had stopped speaking of escape. Now she spoke only of memory. "They will erase us in their papers," she told Ruth. "But the earth remembers. Tell it, when I am gone." The end came not in a blaze, but in a circle of rifles. Phyllis and 6 others were cornered on a dry rise, their backs to a wall of roots. The militia did not rush. They wanted her alive. They wanted to see the woman who had butchered masters on Christmas Eve swing before a crowd in Savannah. They shouted at her to surrender. She lifted the axe and answered with silence. The charge was quick and merciless. Shots cracked. 2 men fell at once. Ruth was struck through the shoulder, dropping to her knees. Phyllis fought like the last ember of a fire, swinging, cutting, her blade splitting muskets, tearing into flesh. One soldier's head burst under the axe. Another staggered screaming with his arm severed. But sheer numbers overwhelmed her. A rifle butt crashed against her jaw. Hands seized her arms, dragging her down into the mud. They bound her in chains, blood pouring from her face, her dress soaked red. Even beaten, she stood when they forced her upright. Witnesses later claimed she spat teeth into the mud and stared at the captain as though daring him to speak. When he ordered her dragged toward Savannah, she laughed, a sound ragged, broken but unafraid. "You'll hang me," she said, "but you'll never bury me. The ground won't take me. I already belong to it." Her trial was no trial at all. The court called her a monster, a butcher, a demon in woman's skin. They never spoke Isaiah's name, never mentioned the whips, the sails, the broken children. On January 12, 1858, Phyllis was hanged in the public square of Savannah. Hundreds gathered, some in horror, some in celebration. She died without bowing her head, but death did not erase her. In the quarters, whispers grew. Some said her spirit roamed the swamps, axe in hand, striking terror into patrols. Others said her soul walked through Riverbend's ashes at night, calling the names of the lost. Children were told to listen to the thunder and storms. It was Phyllis's voice, striking again. The Chamberlain name withered. Their lands were divided, their bloodline scattered. But the memory of Christmas Eve 1857 endured, carried in hushed stories, in the rhythm of work songs, in the silence of the swamp at night. It was not a tale of madness, it was a tale of reckoning. Even when history books omitted her, the land remembered. The soil that drank the blood, the swamp that swallowed the bodies, the smoke that curled into the sky, they kept her name. And so long after her body swung in Savannah, Phyllis lived on, not as a servant, not as a victim, but as a warning, a curse, and a promise that the fight was not yet finished.